Those of you who've been at the conference today, and I hope the next 2 days, will know that what we're trying to do at this conference is to talk about interdisciplinary approaches to the study of American Jews, but beyond that, also to focus on the different media in which history is transmitted. So tonight, we're going to talk about documentary film. It's a great pleasure for me to have a chance to talk with Aviva Kempner and for us to get a little behind-the-scenes look at her process of making film. So let me ask you, Aviva, just as we begin, to talk a little bit about what led you to become a filmmaker in the first place.
You have to understand that I'm a daughter of a professor, and as my brother would agree with me and my nieces, we grew up in a home with a historian. So I always grew up either through my father talking a lot about politics and Jewish history, or with our stepfather hearing a lot about history. So I don't think it's an apple falling far from the tree that I also went into making historical docs. But a lot of it also has to be with being a child of a Holocaust survivor. When I didn't pass the bar, and no, I did well in law school. I ran an immigration clinic. I just don't test well in multiple choice questions, which I think have nothing to do with practicing law, but everything to do with me becoming a filmmaker. So in any event, I was looking for what to do, and it was this Jewish roots thing about wanting to make a film. I think there was a phenomena of us in the late 70s, early 80s, to work in our work to do with the Holocaust. And for me, it was going to make a film about Jews fighting Nazis. And at that time, I thought it was going to be about Warsaw Ghetto. But I went to Yad Vashem, and Itzhak Arad handed me a book. And the reason I mention this is I'm lucky. Every time I decide to do a film on a subject, there's a historical book, and it was called Ghetto in Flames. That book changed the focus of my topic, and that's why I decided to make this film with Josh Woletsky about partisans of Vilna. But I have to mention, a historian almost steered me wrong. And the reason I mention this, I don't mean to deflame anyone, but I went to a conference very early on Holocaust, and I went up to Raoul Hilberg, who, was the scholar on the Holocaust. And I remember saying to him, Professor Hilberg, I'm doing a film on Jews fighting Nazis. And in this heavy German accent, he says, there was no Jewish resistance. There are no records of Jewish resistance. Well, duh. It's not like the Jews were telling the Nazis, when they're going to go smuggle in guns, etc. Luckily, I didn't listen to Hilberg. I mean, he gave me a background because, quite frankly, every time I do a film, it's like doing a PhD in one of my subjects. For Partisans of Vilna, it was getting a PhD in Holocaust studies. For Hank Greenberg, it was American studies. For Yoo-Hoo, Mrs. Goldberg, I think it's a combination of popular culture and feminists. And now for Rosenwald Schools, I think African American studies. So in any event, that may be a little longer answer than you wanted, but it's the 2G thing, and wanting to counter stereotypes. That Jews didn't fight, that wasn't true, that they had fought. And for Hank Greenberg, the Jewish Nebush on the screen, what we all brought up with Woody Allen, that my brother and I were brought up with a strong, wonderful character of a Hank Greenberg. I mean, every Yom Kippur, my dad would talk about Hank Greenberg when we go to services. I thought Hank Greenberg was part of Yom Kippur services growing up. Or for going to the Jewish Museum and seeing this wonderful exhibit of Jews entertaining America and the Goldberg, living room recreated, and realizing that this overbearing, awful mother that we usually see, that men write about, that it was really this wonderful woman who created her own image of a strong, powerful, loving mother that I wanted to put on the screen. So it's both countering stereotypes and doing underknown Jewish heroes. That's what totally motivates me.
I want to push you more on that. I mean, it makes sense what you're saying about how you came to these subjects, but specifically, how did you arrive at the idea to do Hank Greenberg, to do Gertrude Berg?
Okay, I'll tell you, there's epiphany moments. I always say it, my Elijah moment. I'm home in Detroit with a historian stepfather and a mother who's an artist, November for Thanksgiving in Detroit. I was already in law school and having not passed the bar. And they had just, actually this is an Evo story, they had just had a party for Lucien Dobrzynski. And there was the book, Image Before My Eyes. And I'm looking at the book, And I'm looking at these pictures. And these aren't pictures of shtetl Jews, which, you know, was Fiddler on the Roof, but these are pictures with commentary by talking about Polish Jews between the wars. And I started thinking, oh my gosh, there's something really there. And I wanted, you know, I had this second generation drive to do something about, you know, answering the unfair question, because Josh was very clear once I started working with him, that it wasn't so much why didn't Jews resist, but how could they? And I just needed to go make that film. I luckily had an uncle who survived Auschwitz, who was very wealthy, who gave me the initial money to fund the film. So it was that, the I-thou moment of looking at a scholarly book and decided, and then Arad handing me the book and saying, you know, you really must do Partisans of Vilna. Then I'm opening up Partisans of Vilna with Eva for the Righteous Gentiles Foundation in LA, and I'm getting dressed, and I hear Hank Greenberg died. Well, duh. He was my daddy's hero. So I guess a lot of it is also that one of the 10 Commandments, honor your parents, because for my mother, it was not that she was a resistor, although I just said at dinner that if my mother had talked about the war, we didn't actually hear stories growing up, I might not have gone and made the film. So in any event, that was the I-thou moment to go do Hank. I did not know it would take me 13 years. I mean, the problem is raising the money. And it was going to the Jewish Museum and seeing that wonderful exhibit, thank you, Jeffrey, and everyone, and seeing that living room. And I remembered that image. I had used that image a little in other films, and I realized that I had to do Gertrude Berg because Lucille Ball was getting all the credit for the sitcom, and that just wasn't fair.
These are stories of great success and accomplishment. These are wholly admirable figures in every way. I'm wondering, did it ever cross your mind? I'm asking you about A Road Not Taken. Did it ever cross your mind to tell a story of someone where there's a little more ambivalence about their character?
Well, it's interesting you say that because I guess I do Heroes for a Purpose because there's been so much done against Jews. I mean, it's very political, my films. The first film is about fascism. The second film is about anti-Semitism. The third film is about sexism and McCarthyism. And the fourth film is about racism. And I feel the way you can counter and talk about these isms is to pick a classic, wonderful hero that can be blemished. Now, in Hank, I will admit, Beth asked me this question to think about earlier. There's a story of his very crafty negotiating with Al Rosen. Hank was not a nice manager in his post-career. So do I put that in the film or not? Now, I was toying with it, and then I realized you end The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg with Jackie Robinson. That's your great ending. You know, the Jewish player goes out, the African-American player comes in. That's the end of it. And that's the way it was. But there was part of me, and I'll be open on this because I actually have a resolution of it, is that I feel very uncomfortable about negative stereotypes about Jews because it's also about countering those stereotypes in my filmmaking. So I didn't want to show a Jew being a tough negotiator and worrying about money, even though I'm oversensitive about it because I'm Jewish. However, in the DVD that I'm now working on, because Hank is not available on DVD, and I think the glorious thing about DVDs for filmmakers is and we have Marion Hunter here who edited Hank Greenberg and now editing the DVD of Hank, is that we can go back to our outs and really create a whole new storyline. And that's what we're doing now. And in all fairness, Al Rosen will get his day in court where it was in the interview with me saying Hank was awful in the discussions. But I didn't put it in the feature film. I would have if the dramatic moment had been, because after all, we as filmmakers aren't like you as historians to include all the stories. What we're doing is really, you know, first act, the second act, the third act, because I really feel like my filmmaking are docs that feel like features. I mean, that's what I'm trying to achieve every time. So I didn't put that story in. And I can remember in Partisans of Vilna, there's this wonderful story at the end of the film where one of our partisans arrested a young Nazi in the liberation of Vilna and stayed with him all night and would not shoot him the next morning. So Josh and I were going through that and said, let's put that in. And I said, but Josh, we can't put that in without having an earlier story where they caught a Nazi in the woods and they, killed it, hit him to death. Because you can't just have one side of it. You have to be more equal. So that's an example of trying to, be fair on both sides.
Let me shift gears a little and ask you about your process of research. Do you spend time in the archives? Do you rely on academics as experts? And if so, how?
I could not have made any of my films without the books that were coincidentally finished just at the time I decided to make the film. There's no film without scholars. There really isn't, because first of all, they're way ahead of the curve when I start researching. Second of all, the topic is usually pretty esoteric when you start. Who else is going to understand it and lead you? And the archives are absolutely essential. I'm lucky that I make films out of Washington, so we have the National Archives there, the Library of Congress, both the film archives and the book archives, and it's a gold mine. What we do is visual research, so a lot of it is the photos and the archives, and there's all these archival houses. As a matter of fact, I don't believe in fair use, because these archival houses have I'll tell you why. They need to make a living. I have to raise more money because these archival houses have preserved the footage that make my films. I also believe very liberally in using feature footage. I know I've been criticized by academics. For instance, Hank Greenberg, you're talking about the height of anti-Semitism, and the backstory is, as a manager, he could not register at the hotel in Phoenix because he was Jewish. So if you're going to have a film about domestic anti-Semitism, you're going to use Gregory Peck in Gentleman's Agreement, trying to check into a hotel. Because I believe feature films are as much archival, because it was the most important film about anti-Semitism in the 40s. It was also done by a studio head who was not Jewish, while the Jewish studio heads refused to put it on. You will now see in Rosenwald, Work in Progress, a scene from Raisin in the Sun, which was written by a Chicagoan. We're talking about housing in Chicago. The title is a line from Langston Hughes, who got a Rosenwald grant. It's like, and I have Sidney Poitier in the movie. I mean, if you can have Gregory Peck and Sidney Poitier in your movies, you're crazy not to do it. Now, I have a thing on the Marx Brothers. I think they were the most brilliant comedians, as well as actors. So how do I put them in Hank Greenberg? We couldn't quite fit it right in the body of the work, but in the end credits, it's them in an orchestra throwing a baseball. If I were to tell you how much money I spent on that just to have it in the film, but when it came to Yoo-Hoo, Mrs. Goldberg, all of a sudden there's a story that Gertrude was going to Florida with her dad to start a hotel. Coconuts, of course. Another arm and a leg in payment. But it was just a beautiful scene that I think sort of represented that.
I'm wondering what the most vexing challenges you found in either, determining accuracy or finding proper documentation for something a story you want to tell. I mean, you're here with many people who often are confronted with incomplete or sometimes contradictory evidence, and we have to sit down and figure out, well, what are we going to do about this? Are we going to just, talk openly about those contradictions? Are we going to simply come to our own conclusions about them? I'm wondering if you could think of any times where you really faced challenges in terms of again, either documentation, accuracy, what you really couldn't find but wanted to tell.
There's a story in Yoo-Hoo, Mrs. Goldberg, where Gertrude Berg is desperate to keep Philip Loeb, who's been blacklisted on the show. Desperate. She does everything like no one else did. It's the worst blacklist story. She tries every avenue, and then she hears that Cardinal Spellman kept Lena Horne and Harry Belafonte from the blacklist. Of course, they were Catholic. So she goes to see him. She listens to his pleas, and the story goes that she was told by him, "I'll do it if you convert." Now, of course, it's a good ironic laugh, but it turns out that the story was told, she told the story to her daughter. Her daughter is no longer alive. So the question was for me, do I use the story or not, because the daughter is no longer alive? Well, the husband's alive. And I realized and the daughter, and her daughter's still alive. So I realized that I could get it from one of them, and that's good enough validation. So, I don't know, you historians, do you have the rules like the court of law, hearsay or not? I go with hearsay.
So that's a good opening for me to let you
Introduce.
Set up a little bit about the Rosenwald Schools film and how you got into it.
My theme is underknown, and this man is really underknown Jewish heroes. He operated over 100 years ago. He was the head of Sears and Roebuck. He gave away $62 million of his money, and almost half of it was for African American causes, and he's totally underknown. I have to tell you, I just went to Springfield because Julius Rosenwald was born in Springfield. His uncles clothed Abraham Lincoln. One of his uncles accompanied Abraham Lincoln back after his death, the body back, and made the memorial ribbons. And the family home, we were told, was right by Lincoln's home. So I come to Lincoln's home, schedule a meeting with the Park Service. They meet us in a building, their Park Service Administration building, right by the Lincoln home. I'm with Julius Rosenwald's grandson, Peter, you see in the film. We sit down, they said, we have a surprise for you. You see our office, which is an old, wooden build, over 100-year-old building. That was the Julius Rosenwald building, and they never knew it before. So they're happy because then all of a sudden they said, we want to, give New Legacy a chance. So all of a sudden, we've made Lincoln Memorial a Jewish center with a Jewish aspect because of the film research. So I'm real excited about that. And they have two great portraits of Julius Rosenwald. He started out with Jewish causes, and then he read Up from Slavery. Paul Sachs, the brother of Goldman Sachs, sent him the book. So back then, and they also did the IPO for Sears. Now we think the black-Jewish relations started and ended and was the pinnacle of, Heschel marching with Martin Luther King, which was a great moment. I'm not taking away from it. I'm talking about decades earlier, and that's the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington and other things he did. And what's great is he was inspired by his rabbi. He totally believed that philanthropy was one of the most important things he could do as a wealthy man. And I'm hoping that this film will inspire other philanthropists. I think the most important reason I do this film is to inspire the next generations. Although I have to say, I do get sort of delight and pleasure, especially men coming up to me with Hank Greenberg and telling me, as someone just did at dinner, how many times they cried seeing the film. As in fact, one man came out of a film crying, and he said, this is the third time I've seen the film. And I said, you're still crying? So I decided on my gravestone, it's going to say, she made men cry. So Mark, you just affirmed that, right? But I don't think we have enough heroes, and I guess that's the line, or heroines, that I keep on coming to. I think we need them. I think we need them to inspire us to do better as human beings, to do better as Americans. And, some of the same issues that Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington faced 100 years ago are still true in terms of education for people, with not as much privilege. The biggest challenge I have still with the Rosenwald Schools is there's a big debate between Booker T. Washington and W.D. Du Bois. And I'm going to get Skip Gates to talk about it and Levering Lewis. I'm going to get the experts to talk about it and, put it out there, although there is a lot of scholarly rethinking about it. Booker T. Washington was born a slave, wrote about being a slave, and became a great educator. And the Tuskegee Institute was all about education, but a lot of it was about teaching people crafts or, not all high education, but to get people educated. I mean, he taught Julius Rosenwald into giving all this money and building over 5,000 schools. And he was also the most important African-American man in the country, including being the first one to be invited to the White House. What year was that under Roosevelt? 1901. Whoa, that really is early. In any event, Meanwhile, you have an intellectual like Du Bois, African-American intellectual who was born in the free North in Great Barrington, whose theory was that, if I understand it, that we really need to promote the talented tenth, that it was black intellectuals and artisans will bring everyone up, and also not to support segregated schools. The big fight was over NAACP, the establishment of the NAACP, supporting desegregation as the big goal versus segregation. And I think they were both right in terms of the times. Because what are you going to do, not have these 5,000 schools and wait for segregation? You know how many years, decades later? So I think it was and I think it was also personality clashes and a little maybe ego clashes. But what's interesting is Du Bois got 2 Rosenwald grants and wrote the most glowing obituary when Julius Rosenwald died. So the material is pretty easy in terms of presenting it. And I'll just let the scholars talk because it's their debate, because I happen to personally think that both men were right in terms of what they were trying to do for African Americans. But it's going to call, I know ahead of time there's going to be a whole new debate started, but you know what? As long as people buy theater tickets, it's fine. It's interesting because we're in, at least some of you are scholars here. Let me just tell you a little bit what happens after you get a Rosenwald. It's not always so easy. John Hope Franklin, who's noted as the most important African-American scholar, so he gets a Rosenwald and he goes down to Alabama to go work in the archives, like we all do, right? Tallulah Bankhead, for those of you who are youth impaired, Tallulah Bankhead, I just made that up, that's pretty good, huh? She was a famous dramatic actress, and her aunt ran the Alabama archives and was as racist as the day was long. So she was told that there was a scholar, African-American scholar, that, from Harvard that wanted to come use the archives. So she comes swashing out and she says, "I hear there's a Harvard nigger here." So luckily he didn't he didn't blow his cool. He realized that to get into the archives, he had to charm her. So when he started talking to her, she realized he also had a FIS background. She says, "Oh, you're a Southern gentleman. It's okay, you can use the archives." But that's how insidious it was. Or Augusta Savage, this African-American artist, who had earlier gotten a scholarship to go and study in Paris until they found out that she was African-American, and they wrote her, "Well, we don't want to offend the Southern sisters that would be on the trip." So they took away her scholarship. Only a Rosenwald was colorblind. By the way, whites also got Rosenwald Fund grants, including Woody Guthrie. How great is that? Although, his songs are going to be expensive, but it is really cool that I got Woody Guthrie in this movie. Gordon Parks, who was in Chicago, had worked as a porter on trains, got interested in photography. He got a Rosenwald. He took the famous iconic picture, which actually I have a copy of and I own, while he had a Rosenwald in Chicago. Jacob Lawrence, the Great Migration series that MoMA bought and that the Phillips Gallery bought, Rosenwald Fund. So this is what the belief in certain people, and I just interviewed Charles Drew's daughter. Now, how many people know who Charles Drew was? He developed blood plasma. He's really important in terms of how we, sort of the precursor to Red Cross. Also to breaking barriers that you don't separate African-American blood gathering from white, that the blacks should be able to be members of the AMA, very, very important in the study of blood. He got a Rosenwald because he was in his senior year. He was going to McGill Medical School. Why was he going to McGill Medical School? Because no white school would let him in the States. In any event, he had been a triathlete. He was refereeing games to support himself. It was the middle of the Depression. His daddy couldn't help him. He was from Washington. He had grown up going to the Rosenwald-supported Y, and he couldn't finish his senior year of medical school because when he was refereeing games, it interfered with his hospital hours. He wrote, and his daughter reads me the grant. She has a copy of the grant and said, I really need this money to complete medical school. And the Rosenwald Fund gives him the grant, and he turns out to be one of the most important doctors in terms of the history of, blood collection. Madam Walker, who was the first millionaire, African-American millionaire, who developed products for African-American women. What was her role with Julius Rosenwald? Well, Annapolis needed grants for their Y, and she was the first one to step up with $1,000. And all of a sudden people started saying, who's this African-American woman? Where did she get all her money? And it was sort of an interesting aside. By giving the money, her status rose in America as well as in the African-American community. And Booker T finally, I'm getting a little enthusiastic about my new film, so go ahead. Do you have more questions, Beth? Sorry.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do.
I mean, you have to love your subjects. I think that's the biggest reason I do heroes. You as historians, don't you have to love your subjects? You know, I mean, that's what it is. I want to inspire people. They inspire me. I want my films to inspire. I want the younger generation to walk out and say, we can make a difference. I want the older generation that maybe has some money and say, you know, I should make a difference. Because, you know, cinema can entertain, which I think my films do. Cinema can educate, which I think they do, but I also think they can inspire. The most important thing is if you have family members that have never been recorded about their experiences, that's the thing you can do right in your family. I regret to the day my mother died that I really didn't film her myself. The Shoah Project did. Or even my dad's history. I have all his documents about writing during World War II or after it. Do your own oral histories. That's the first thing that all of us can do. And keep on doing your histories.
Thanks, Aviva.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.